So recording appears to be in progress. Welcome everyone to this Monday, 30th of March, 2026, to our Social Rights Ireland weekly discussion. Roisin, unfortunately, at short notice was called away and I agreed to moderate in her place. So hopefully I'll do her justice. So our topic is really kind of like just the massive elephant that's sitting in every single room at the moment, which is the you know the astonishing, we were just talking before the recording, the astonishingly shambolic kind of meltdown, grind down, implosion, whatever you want to call it, of the US empire with all its military might and all of its lack of intellectual might, at least among its leadership cadre. Um, it's funny, I was reminded again, Morgan, last week you mentioned that adage, it's often attributed to Lenin, although I'm not sure which Lenin, that there are decades when nothing seems to happen, followed by weeks when decades seem to happen. And I think the week since our last Zoom last Monday is one of those weeks. Earlier today, when we were discussing what to kind of focus on, Roisin mentioned that the stark contrast between how this war is being perceived throughout the West, but particularly here in Ireland, or sorry, here in Ireland and throughout the West, compared to previous US-led military adventures, of which anyone above the age of 30 can remember at least three. I personally very well remember the build up to the Iraq War in 2003. There were tens of thousands of us marched in Dublin, a million apparently in London in late February 2020, sorry, 2003, yeah. And I mean, at the time, that was one of the first, it was certainly the largest demo I'd ever been to. The mood was very buoyant. There was a sense that with this much public mobilization, it just couldn't happen. They could not go ahead. And the Americans were still, going through the motions with their appeal to the weapons inspectors and the UN. And it just seemed like there had been such a successful show of public disfavor that, how could they just ride roughshod over that? Whatever about the Americans, but certainly among the Brits. And yet within a few weeks of those demos, the Iraq War, the 2003 Iraq War, had begun. And within what seemed like weeks, but certainly within a few months, the drama had almost, certainly in how it was perceived in the Western media and how it was presented, the drama had kind of slipped out of it. It had become a kind of dystopian background music. People had gone back to making jokes about George W. Bush's, malapropisms. And the shock and awe war of conquest was replaced by this so-called insurgency. And they started the media started reporting on it pretty much the same way they reported on the war in Lebanon. Mainly without context, a kind of a sideshow of barbarism. And just as in Lebanon, you'd hear about bomb attacks by sectarian militias. A Shia militia bombed a police station, a Sunni group bombed somebody else, and the vast majority of the victims were, of course, Iraqis. And people settled into a kind of maybe slightly disquiet, but essentially here in Ireland, I think pretty much throughout the Western world, a kind of certain apathy. Every so often there'd be a flare-up, there'd be a scandal, there was the torture pictures from Abu Ghraib, there were massacres at Nisour Square by what were they called? Not Black Rock, Blackwater. There was the Haditha, the horrific Haditha massacre. There was the time the bodies of the mercenaries, the so-called contractors. I remember hearing that word for the first time and learning for the first time that there were all of these mercenaries active in Iraq from a bridge in Fallujah. Then, of course, there was the massive assault on Fallujah involving a lot of depleted uranium, which is still having horrific effects on the people there. But most of the time, this was just a kind of a background. It was kind of like, it was a droning sound, slightly irritating, but didn't disrupt life very much here in the West. And it was, in a sense, also, I think, maybe the last major war kind of made for TV, or at least the last time that the major corporate propagandists could manufacture something close to consent, maybe not quite consent, but certainly passive acquiescence for a war. And and all of that was also made possible by the fact that for the Western powers, the casualties were, what Thatcher would have called an acceptable level. By the time the Americans left Iraq, they'd lost somewhere between 4 and 5,000 soldiers, compared to 60,000 in Vietnam over actually a similar time span, if not a slightly shorter one in Vietnam, depending on where you count the beginning and the end. But one of the big differences, of course, with the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, with the more recent wars, is that the ratio of dead to wounded was very different. It was basically 1 dead to 3 wounded in Vietnam, whereas in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was roughly 10 wounded to every dead. So there were far fewer, a lot of broken bodies coming back, but not as many coffins. And that again made it politically more palatable in the United States. So by now, war has just become the norm. It's just what Americans do. And they say that for a man whose only tool is a hammer, every problem is a nail. And that is the only hammer that the United States seems to possess now. And yet it doesn't seem particularly good at using the hammer.
Not that very much there. I'll give them a bit longer, but
Yeah. Anyway, so I just wanted to kind of use that as a kind of an intro to talking about the fact that it struck me that there was a lot of talk in the build up to this war that it would be asymmetrical warfare. So essentially, what you had in Vietnam, what you had in Algeria, but maybe obviously for the age of AI and drones. But it's turning out to be not quite asymmetrical in the way we expected. So the US still has all the big flashy stuff, the aircraft carriers, the nuclear subs, the stealth bombers. But in terms of strategy and intelligence, the asymmetry seems to be reversed. So, where some people have used the analogy of the Iranians playing chess and the Americans playing drafts, but it seems to me that gives the Americans a little too much credit. I think they're playing at best poker, at worst snakes and ladders. So with that, I'd like to call on Dara, a regular contributor to Social Rights Ireland, to talk to us about that strategy that the Iranians have been employing so effectively, in terms of using economic warfare against the West and in terms of hitting Western American proxies where it hurts the most, and what is likely to be both the short term, so let's say this time next week or the next few weeks, but also the long term fallout from that and how it's likely to how the balance of power is shifting in West Asia. So Dara, if you unmute and jump in there, and I'll.
I'll give you 5 minutes, Darren. But I
Very
don't
well.
think any of this is impressive.
Thanks. So, basically, with the economic impacts that we're seeing in particular now, is that the big trick up the sleeve, really, that the Iranians have had, and a big reason for the reluctance of the US and Israelis to go for the full-blown invasion is obviously the Strait of Hormuz. And we have seen after the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is that the oil prices globally have completely skyrocketed to record levels. So just since the start of March, that's 51% increase that we've seen in oil prices, basically from about $70 a barrel up to, I think now about $112. So the thing with oil, so the global economy, if you watch how GDP and energy use fluctuate, essentially for every 1% increase in GDP, you get a 1% increase in energy consumption. And about any 80% of energy is still fossil fuels. So once you get an increase of oil prices, it essentially operates as a tax on all economic activity. So, if you look at global recessions since World War II, essentially every single global recession is preceded by a spike in oil prices. So that means every single activity from food production to transport to industrial activity completely dependent on oil.
You can talk later on, mate.
And we see that essentially slowing down all global economic activity. So within this, this cost is not shared equally whatsoever. So, this plan of attack on Iran has been planned really since at least the 90s, in reality since 1979. But the escalation, we've all known, it's been coming for a long time, and the invasion of Venezuela and the kidnapping of Maduro was likely US shoring up fossil fuel interests in the Americas because they did anticipate this closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So, what I wonder is how much, really, even though it is a surprise, I think with how impressive the Iranian response has been, I think that there has been an element of surprise in how resilient Iran, not only internally in terms of the resistance economy that they have built to be able to have a high degree of self-sufficiency and sovereignty, even in the midst of attacks on key infrastructure, even in the midst of all-out assaults on their currency and on their economy. They've been able to maintain their economy. They've been able to maintain and escalate their ability to hit targets across the region. And to be able to do so in the midst of really incredible disruption has been a shock. And you even see now in the likes of The Economist, even interviewing British intelligence, and even they're admitting that Iran has the upper hand. So within this, there are a lot of moving parts that make it a little bit difficult to predict in terms of what is going to happen next. But what I imagine is that oil prices are going to remain high and continue to increase. I don't know if they'll ever come back down to where they were even a few months ago. So what does that mean is significant inflation. And what do we know about inflation is really inflation operates as a wealth transfer between working class and then the owners of capital. So within this, we are likely to see really the working classes around the world hit the hardest, and in countries especially that are importers of energy. Ireland imports 100% pretty much of its oil anyway, and about 80% of its energy consumption. So within this, the uh, balance of power is shifting already. We see that the um, axis really around Iran is being supported by the Russians, by the Chinese to a lesser extent, and even the Iranians are now charging oil prices in Chinese yuan essentially to operate through that. So what does that do is also significantly threatens the petrodollar, which has already been under attack for the last few years, really, since in particular the Russia-Ukraine war. And we're seeing now more and more energy being traded in currencies outside of the US dollar. What does this mean is much less money actually works its way back into the US economy, and we see then decrease in asset prices and in investor appetite really in the United States. So within all of this, we are going to see, I imagine, a global recession. And that is not likely to be only economic. It's going to link in with a lot of the other structural vulnerabilities in the capitalist world system. And this, in the long term, is a big opportunity. However, in the short term, I believe it's likely to lead to a lot of pain, really, and that pain always is felt by the most vulnerable people in society. So, within this, we need to also be thinking in terms of while we do have relative stability, particularly here in Ireland, we do need to be thinking about what we're doing with this stability and with this ability to be able to organize and to be able to look ahead and understand what the structural vulnerabilities in the Irish economy are in terms of our energy dependence, in terms of our lack of food sovereignty, in terms of our general disorganization in terms of workers and renters in particular, and think ahead really towards what this huge global shock is going to look like, especially for a country that has really attached itself so closely to the US and British and European economies, which I believe are all incredibly vulnerable, especially the European economy, which is not an energy producer. When you look at the European economy compared to the US, compared to the Russians, compared to even the Chinese, who aren't completely dependent, as they do produce a lot of coal and renewables, but energy really is what makes the world go round, and it's where really Europe and Ireland are very vulnerable in, I would say.
Thank you very much, Tara. That's really a superb summation. A lot of questions there. First question is, I don't know if it's by if you deliberately turned off your video, but I don't have any I don't see any image for you. It's just a dark screen. Is that I hope that's not just me, is it?
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
I can see myself anyway, but I don't know if others can see me.
Can everybody see Dara? No. We're just
Ah,
seeing a black screen. I wasn't
oh,
sure if that was, now we see your name.
oh, I don't know what's going on then. I can see myself, but
All right.
hmm.
Not to worry. Just to come back to you on that, I mean, it looks like sheer incompetence. I mean, the fact that Europe and the United States, while already embroiled in one war that has put energy supply under severe strain, is now attacking the country. Oh, there you are. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, good. Because your image is frozen. I mean, is it just incompetence? I mean, surely, I mean, you talked about how much the Iranians planned for this and that they've been able to weather far more than the Americans expected the attacks, both the economic attacks and now the military ones. And then on the other side, has there been any preparation for this in the European Union or in the United States?
Yeah, it often seems like incompetence if you judge it through the lens of the nation state or what's best for a specific country or region as a whole. But really, this war was decided by a very small group of people who are benefiting massively from it. So when it comes to, say, Russia and Ukraine, what were the big wealth transfers really that happened was from the workers and the renters and the normal people in, especially, of course, Ukraine and Russia, but all throughout Europe, where Europeans all of a sudden were buying liquid natural gas from the United States for four times the price as what we were paying from Russia. And this is huge windfall for US fossil fuel companies. And fossil fuel companies make about $3 billion in profits per day. So they are making fortunes from this. Then we also look at, in terms of the financiers who are essentially profiting from rigging markets and making bets in advance of geopolitical decisions. So once you know what direction a market is going to go in, they knew Iran were going to close the Strait of Hormuz. They knew that the Iranians were going to blow up assets across the Gulf regions. They knew largely, even though there's been some surprise as to Iran having the upper hand. I mean, I don't think anything that's happened has been completely outside of what they would have prepared for, or to at least have had some contingency plans for it. Then you obviously have the interests of the military industrial complex who are making fortunes and are expected to make more and more. The more conflict there is, the more countries are likely to actually get their GDP, spend 5% of their GDP on military. And then you also have the owners, really, of land and the sort of global choke points in the economy, in particular around energy reserves and food and really the necessities. So, for these people who really run the world economy, they're doing pretty well out of it. And when you combine a few of the other sort of macro trends in terms of, say, even environmental breakdown, in terms of artificial intelligence, etc., we are in the midst of a rupture already. We're in the midst of a revolution, really, from the top down, and a complete restructuring of the global economy. And a key aspect of this, too, we have to remember, is Greater Israel. And the United States seem to be serving the interests of Israel far more than they are serving the interests of themselves. So Iran has been sort of the last domino in Operation Clean Break, which was written for Netanyahu by United States defense officials 30 years ago. And they believe now is the moment to do so after the sort of systematic attack on the Iranian economy, after the kidnap of Maduro, and after the fall of Syria. So there's interests that are profiting massively from this, and this is really who the US military really serve rather than necessarily their own national interests today, I would say.
Right. But I mean, the impression I have is that like it's all about extremely short-term interest. Like you mentioned, people betting on these predictive markets, and even what Trump has been doing the last couple of weeks with his various, completely confected announcements about talks and threats, and then back to talks, is all designed to manipulate the markets, to calm the markets and then heat up the markets. But I mean, that's a kind of a one-trick pony. Once you've used that a few times, you can't really use it anymore. I mean, just on the question of these Gulf monarchies like Dubai and Abu Dhabi and even Saudi Arabia, surely this is fast making those places untenable. And if they all collapse, surely that will have massive blowback for Western capital, or not?
Yeah, for sure. So, in terms of the Gulf countries, so essentially in the world system, the role that they play is ensuring that energy is sold in US dollars. They then funnel these profits back into US assets so that US assets continue to grow. And in exchange, the US promises defense of the Gulf monarchies. And this now, there does seem to be a big change in this relationship. You see Trump openly using words like, Bin Salman has to kiss my ass, and that would have been really unthinkable quite recently. And that's likely as a response also to the Gulf countries really hedging their bets and starting to build new alliances outside of the US controlled sphere. On top of this, the US has proven themselves to be inadequate at defending the Gulf countries from Iranian attacks. It seems like Iran has been able to really hit them more or less at will, take down bases and different infrastructure across the Gulf countries. And that has likely also broken some of the illusion of what a US defense alliance actually looks like in 2026. And we see then, even with the relationships that are starting to form around that, where, these are some of the most militarized with some of the most advanced military equipment and highest military spending in the world. They haven't really yet shown their hand. Neither has the likes of Turkey. And even when it comes to Russia and China, yes, they're doing some support, but they haven't really gotten fully involved in the ways that they yet could. So there's, I think, some general reorganization that's happening, particularly between the Gulf countries and the US. And as I mentioned already, with this petrodollar agreement, this is already really um, on a very limited timescale, even before this war, and even without the petrodollar agreement necessarily breaking down, because you have a lot of the other energy suppliers are already trading outside of the dollar. So within this, that special relationship was already um, falling apart to begin with. And the thing is, with how the United States operates, it has the deep state, yes, and then you also have a lot of different interests who are all trying to dictate policy at the same time. They're largely aligned in terms of a shared class interest, but as the contradictions sharpen, you also have some sort of inter-capitalist, inter-imperialist rivalry occurring at the same time, where we're starting to see that sort of shared interest, whether it's between even the United States and Europe and the Gulf countries, whether it's between the US ruling class themselves. We are starting to see some splintering within that. And Trump is also controlled by many other interests outside of even just the sort of corporate sphere, in terms of who might have blackmail on him, in terms of the Epstein class, potentially even the Russians, certainly the Israelis. So that leads to a sort of manic activity at times, because he's likely trying to have to satisfy different bases, telling people different things in terms of what they're going to do, whilst at the same time working to manipulate markets. And even in terms of recession, is that this recession, again, regardless of conflict, it's coming just because of the contradictions within the capitalist economic system already. So when we even think of recession, and we think back even to 2008, we think back even just to COVID, what did we see really were historic wealth transfers from the poor to the rich. And recessions, to them, they're also incredible opportunities to be able to consolidate assets and concentrate power even further, especially in terms of securing things like land, and to be able to essentially develop their own industrial base, that we're seeing through the likes of tariffs and other things that, yes, they seem to hurt the US economy in the short run, but they're trying to essentially reindustrialize, and to be able to try and produce a much higher percentage of their weapons within the United States too. So there's a lot of competing interests at play, which makes the behavior sometimes difficult to gauge, because it often seems very inconsistent. And I think, to me, that's kind of this contradiction behind like the long-term planning of the deep state relative to the short-term interests of a lot of the puppet masters behind the scenes.
Wow, thank you for that, Derek. That's so that what you're saying in a nutshell is it's madness, but there's method within this madness.
Exactly. Exactly. So, like,
Yeah.
this idea even of like disaster capitalism, that Naomi Klein would talk about, and she even quotes Milton Friedman, who's kind of the person who's credited with the ideology of neoliberalism. And he has a quote, I probably won't get it exactly right, but basically he says something along the lines of, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And the type of change that occurs depends essentially on the ideas that are lying around at the time. More so than just ideas, it's really the power interests and what class is more organized to take advantage of the crisis when it does occur.
So we're looking at the Great Reset 2.0.
Yeah, something like that anyway.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dara. I could let you go on. I personally, I find it very, very illuminating, the way that you're able to pull it together. I knew some of this stuff, but it can feel also, just so. so bewildering because things are changing. The ground seems to be shifting so much. I'd like to, before I bring in Morgan, I just want to read out a comment from Owen Buchanan. He writes, "There's something of a reaction happening within American capitalism. Before, or at least since at least 1990, the international capital used to behave structurally as a unified class, but recently it very much appears the capitalists are splitting along national lines, although their national interests are very different to the national interests of the workers. This is why American capitalists are more than happy to throw the world markets into chaos for their own gain. Even though American capitalists maybe might be an overgeneralization, what we see is merely the most dominant elements within it. For example, tech probably doesn't want $112 barrels of oil. Agricultural capitalists don't want imported fertilizer to skyrocket, but the military industrial capitalists are quite content to impose these conditions. Sure, yeah, it's a kind of it's a zombie capitalism. It's a race to the to a dead finish. So Morgan, if you are ready to go, I think it's a good moment to bring you in. If, as we mentioned before the start, it would be really good if you could give us a little bit of your take on the kind of geopolitical balance. Dara already mentioned this kind of sea change, no pun intended, by Iran in charging, first of all, charging a toll for ships to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, but then also to add insult to injury for the United States, or maybe injury to injury, charging that toll in Chinese yuan, thereby, chipping away a little bit further at dollar hegemony. Can you unmute, come in, and take it from there?
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Dara, for that. I suppose what you said there. It's very illuminating. Even all these weeks later into the war, it's good to be able to learn from you, especially on the consequences around the world and the shifting sands, as it were. But to what you said, Stephen, it can certainly be said every week that Trump really truly was the accelerationist candidate in 2024. As you say, when it comes to Iran adding injury to injury by charging, I think it's equivalent to $2 million in yuan for safe passage through the through Hormuz. That's very likely going to be at least in some way a sense of what's to come in the long term. I don't think that that's going to be walked back because Iran holds so many cards in how this war is playing out, and the trends where it's actually going to end up. So yeah, this is probably the greatest acceleration of the collapse of the petrodollar that we've seen so far. We've anticipated it for some time. It's obviously it was trending that way anyway, but very, very gradually. So much so that we were questioning whether we would see it at all in the next 15 or 20 years, or if this is going to be a slow fade out. But no, it's going out in a blaze of, you wouldn't say glory, but, disgrace. So, that's obviously a positive. Now, I know we are talking about a war here every week, but I can't help but feel very positive about where it's going. And it's strange to say that when so many people are dying, particularly in Iran. But ultimately, we have to remember that through these kind of hardships that we are witnessing in other parts of the world is, by all accounts, for any educated observer, is leading to a better world. So I suppose we'll get into some of the chains of the axis of resistance and how they're developing and how they're fighting this war at the moment. So I suppose we'll go to South Lebanon first. And in the last 24 hours, 3 UNIFIL troops have been killed in 2 different incidents. Now, I know this isn't a great number of people in the grand scheme of things, but this is going to be an issue for the European powers in how they react to this, because this is 3 troops of which there probably will come many more. because certainly one of the incidents today was carried out by the Israelis, where 2 of them were killed. So how that's going to be, how that's going to be presented to European populations is going to be interesting, because I can't expect that the UNIFIL troops that remain in Lebanon are great fans of the Israelis. And that's not always been the case, because a lot of them have been quite adverse to Hezbollah and the idea of Lebanese resistance. Sometimes the militaries don't attract the most, should we say, progressive of minds. But in this case, certainly there is a lot of hatred, justifiably, for the Israelis and by extension the Americans. So Hezbollah themselves have announced that they've targeted over 120 tanks. I think I put the figure at 47 last week. Obviously, that was an undercount. You don't have to wait for more than 30 minutes before a new, security incident is announced in South Lebanon. So that's a great increase in their readiness this time around in comparison to 2023 and 2024. They're a much more effective fighting force. One thing I've noticed is that a lot of the videos they're releasing, and they are releasing a lot more videos than they were in the previous stage of the war, is that they are cameras that are set up looking at a particular spot, be it 300 meters away or 500 meters away, at a spot where the Lebanese resistance have placed an explosive device. So they've lured a lot of Israeli actions towards certain trails, towards certain previously occupied areas, and they are remote detonating the troops and the tanks, and you can see quite a lot of losses occurring on the Israeli side. So we are seeing a lot more videos of this. So this speaks to, I suppose, just their ingenuity in being able to set up this infrastructure during the period where they were not responding, and they were simply soaking up attacks from the Israelis. It's quite astonishing that they've been able to do it, because the Israelis, by all accounts, set up very many hundreds, potentially thousands of cameras around South Lebanon in order to stop this from happening. So their electronic warfare capabilities have obviously increased. So with these cameras as well, they're obviously relaying. Somebody's watching these cameras. They're relaying to a third party, that this is, that you need to detonate the device, or you need to target it with a preset missile that's already targeted to that exact spot. So that's it's something we're seeing again and again. Hezbollah are having far more success than than they were experiencing in 2023 and 2024, and that's to be expected, I suppose. Despite the fact that they did take a lot of damage in that time, they weren't anticipating the Al-Aqsa flood. So their combat readiness wasn't necessarily all there in 2023. Indeed, very many of their members who are now combat troops were simply involved in the political side of the organization, or the community side of the organization. So, as well as that, their weapons have obviously increased in terms of their, in terms of their output. So, where do they get these weapons? So obviously, we're very well aware now that they did receive a lot of weapons from the collapse of the Syrian Arab Army, and a lot of the officer class and a lot of soldiers. They ensured that these weapons were transferred over the border during the collapse and immediately after the collapse, when there was no security at the borders at those times. I understand that Maher al-Assad is also credited with organizing for some of this transfer of some of the high-grade weaponry. Maher al-Assad obviously is a brother of Bashar al-Assad, and we're not quite sure where he is. He could be in Moscow, he could be in Lebanon, he could be in Iraq, but he certainly isn't in Syria. So there's also reports of not just former SAA soldiers fighting alongside Hezbollah in South Lebanon, but also dying in South Lebanon. So they've continued the fight because they might have been a bit more ideologically driven in terms of their support for the axis of resistance when they were in the Syrian Arab Army prior to the collapse in December of 2024. Something that's somebody who's entered the war officially in the last 4 or 5 days is Ansar Allah in Yemen as well. Now, it's a bit too early to say whether their capabilities have increased along with Hezbollah's. but obviously they are able to add I suppose, a unique avenue of attack against the forces of the West and their allies in the region by being able to effectively close the Red Sea, or the what's the name of this strait? Al Mabad Strait.
Bab al-Mandab.
Bab al-Mandab. Thanks. So obviously, Yemen and Ansarullah are a very curious fighting organization in that no matter what their capabilities, they will be party to a war in the region if there is a war to be fought. So this is something that I will always be in awe of, that they're wholly driven towards the goal of liberating the land of Palestine. So that is their primary war goal, and that is what they stand for right now. So much so that they've already released statements, some of their spokespeople for Ansarullah, saying, if Israel were to attack Saudi Arabia, we would stand with Saudi Arabia. And they obviously mentioned other countries, but Saudi Arabia was significant insofar as Saudi Arabia is credited or discredited with killing 450,000 Yemeni people over a 10-year period prior to the outbreak of this war. So an incredible mindset that they have is something to be admired. And I'm keenly looking forward to finding out over the coming weeks what their capabilities are, whether they've increased their capabilities, whether they've changed their tactics, and what effect that they will have in the area.
If I can just cut across you there for a second, Morgan. I mean, a lot of people have made the point that closing the Strait of Hormuz for the Iranians is not technically particularly difficult because it's so narrow they can simply fire artillery from the shore, so they don't even need to rely that much on missile technology. Would it be similar? I guess it's similar for the Yemenis, right? All they have to do is hit a few ships. Insurance companies won't insure them; they can't sail, and the whole thing. I mean, that's how it worked out last time, right? When they were fighting in solidarity with the people of Gaza.
Well, that's correct. Yes, it's an insurance issue for people trying to pass that strait, and they don't necessarily need to fire off a massive missile salvo. It's they have particularly good drone warfare. I did notice that because I recall there was one incident. Now this wasn't fired at the water itself, but towards Israel, where they fired off a series of drones that flew no more than 10 feet off above the sea level along the sea towards Israel, and actually managed to strike Haifa, I think it was, or a southern city anyway in Israel. And it was undetected because it flew so close to the surface. Now, obviously, taking into account the curvature of the Earth, this was a particularly amazing feat from people who are effectively have a wall built up around them for the last decade and a half. So, yes, so their ability to reach ships at sea is not to be, underestimated. And indeed, I think their greatest success of the previous stage of the war was making an aircraft carrier turnaround, because due to their actions, they lost multiple fighter jets because of their evasive maneuvers that they had to take because of the incoming drones or missiles. I don't recall whether they have drones or missiles or both at the time. But so they will, their entry into the war will create a lot more problems for the West, and that's to be welcomed, of course. I suppose another chain of the axis as well, the Iraqi militias. Now, something has been something occurred over the last week where a number of Iraqi Kurdish groups were attacked with both missiles and drones, and these were initially attributed to the Iranians and the Iranian militias in Iraq, or the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, or the Shia militias, we should call them. This has been denied by the Iranians. It's been denied by some of the Shia groups in Iraq. However, the reason that I suppose it's been such big news, particularly online, is because it's been carried so widely in the Kurdish community, or the Kurdish-backed community, and in some European media as well. So this kind of adds to what we've been saying again over the last couple of weeks, the attack on Qatar or Aramco or Turkey or Cyprus. This isn't the Iranians or indeed Diego Garcia. This is clearly the Israelis carrying out, or the Israeli allies carrying out these attacks in order to provoke a Kurdish reaction, because clearly the Kurdish groups, despite the military alliance that they formed in the weeks prior to the war, they're getting cold feet. They don't want to go over the border. They see Iran's capabilities in terms of their rocket warfare, in terms of their electronic warfare, in terms of their intelligence. They don't want to test their land troops because they know that they face certain death. So this is the Israelis and the Americans are clearly toying with these Kurds, toying with the Kurds in order to provoke them into perhaps crossing the border in an organized fashion in the coming weeks or months. It's a sign of pure desperation. So the latest one, I think, is the desalination plant in Kuwait that was attacked over the weekend. This, yet again, is another incident that the Iranians are outright denying that they had anything to do with. They don't seem to be keen to attack any desalination plants. Now, holding that card in reserve, obviously, because the implications of wiping out those facilities, not just in Israel, but obviously across the Gulf, is an entire shutdown of those countries. It makes them unviable, unlivable. So this isn't something that Iran are particularly interested in doing. So this desalination facility wasn't entirely wiped out. It was partially attacked. And now that's not something the Iranians would be interested in doing either, because they don't fire warning shots to these places. They tell you they're going to hit them before they hit them, and then they wipe them out. And that's been the way it's going. I suppose in more in terms of how Iran are doing against Israel and US directly, the information obviously control is weakening, but it still remains strong, particularly in terms of troop deaths. The IRGC Navy commander was killed over the weekend. So, we are getting news in terms of still decapitation exercises that are being carried out against the Iranians. It's difficult to know how the alleged decapitation strikes are, what effect they're having in Israel, because obviously we still have a lot of rumors of, dead public figures, in the military, intelligence brass, and indeed in politics, but we're yet to find any confirmation of any of those particular alleged assassinations. So it's hard to know how many have been killed in Iran. Iran are saying that over 2,000 people have been killed. Now, when you see the attacks on civilian infrastructure, and bear in mind that there's been little to no prior warning of these attacks, it's hard to imagine that only 2,000 have died. But I would trust Iranian figures insofar as that, these figures are, including people that have been identified. So chances are the figure is slightly higher than 2,000, but more than likely under 10,000. 100,000 homes have been destroyed, much of them concentrated in Tehran. Obviously, the intelligence is well hidden from the public, but one thing that should be noted is that American commanders are terrified to meet in person anywhere across the Gulf, because the intelligence that the Iranians are able to gather through sympathizers in the area, through networks in the area, and indeed through Chinese intelligence sharing is significant. So the fact that the American commanders are refusing to meet in person, or they're just simply not meeting in person, is an indication that there has been successful assassinations or decapitation strikes throughout the Gulf over the last month. So throughout March, it should be noted that the US launched almost 700 Tomahawk missiles, including 240 in the opening 2 days of the war. This represents probably 80% of the entire stockpile that they have of Tomahawk missiles, which is very significant, because their offensive capabilities are clearly going to be limited very soon, and indeed their air defense as well. So the Patriot air defense interceptors are almost gone. They're approaching almost 3,000 used in the month of March. They might reach 3,000 today. Overall, I'm not sure how many Patriot air defense interceptors there are, but I don't believe there are very many more than 3,000 in their stockpile. And they have no capabilities of replacing these, because despite the many years that they had to prepare for this war, they were too busy damaging other parts of the globe, perhaps having a lot of hubris come from their successes elsewhere, and they perhaps didn't think they needed to actually resolve the issue of stockpiles before engaging Iran. So the and also there are very many missiles and drones that are hitting Israeli targets with no sirens and no interceptors. So you see a lot more videos in the last couple of days where there is no prior warning, but you see the strikes happening across Israel. And this is an indication that they're not just firing blind, but they're also blind to incoming attacks. This speaks to Iran's success in the opening week of the war, where they were hitting the advanced radar systems, and Hezbollah indeed in the second week of the war, hitting advanced radar systems across the Gulf and Israel in order to stop them from fighting to their capabilities. So and of course, it should be noted the Iranians are quite proud of a precision strike on an E-3 AWACS plane, which is aerial warfare and anyway, we'll get around to that. But a plane which will take over 1 billion to replace. I think the initial cost of the plane was 600 million. However, if they want to replace it now, it'll cost them over 1 billion and quite a lot of time. So I don't think it will even be replaced. So in Europe, you're looking at, if you want to book holidays, jet fuel has over doubled in price in Europe in the last month. That's going to have a significant impact over the course of the next few months. I suppose another thing as well, it should be noted, I saw earlier today al-Jolani was in Germany. So al-Jolani, the al-Qaeda leader of Syria, was in Germany. And this is significant for a number of reasons, because it wasn't expected that he would be in Germany until very recently. I think it was very recently organized at this particular visit. And a lot of people were suspecting initially that it was because of his legions of supporters in Germany, which I think amount a number over 1 million, potentially being sent home, potentially being repatriated to Syria. And I think this is less likely than perhaps a discussion on a potential bringing forward of the timeframes of potential pipelines through Syrian territory in order to alleviate the concerns of a later shutdown of the Hormuz or the Red Sea. So this is, again, I think that's a likely reason for his visit and the likely subject of the discussions there. And if that is true, which I believe it is also a sign of utter desperation and complete, I suppose, detachment from reality. Because if the Europeans think really that they can secure a pipeline through Syria that is not going to be damaged by the very, very many numerous roaming Takfiri elements in the country, then they're living in dreamland. It's impossible. The only way they could have gotten a pipeline through Syria and secured it is through having good relations with the al-Assad government. But that opportunity is gone because they wanted to use the Syrian state for other reasons.
And sorry, Morgan, just to come in there, we're talking here about a pipeline to carry Syrian oil or to carry Iraqi Saudi oil via Syria?
To carry oil and gas from the Gulf primarily, and probably from maybe some of their interests in Iraq in the long term, but I don't think that's realistic anyway. I think Iraq is certainly trending away from the US and Israeli access even before this stage of the war. So yeah, that was an interesting kind of an interesting visit. And if we don't hear anything about repatriation of Syrian citizens from Germany into Syria over the next couple of weeks, then you can guarantee that the pipelines were the subject of the discussion. So last week we said that Brazil was the canary in the coal mine with regard to food security for various regions as well. But we also noted Australia as being a potential canary in the coal mine for goods and services. And we know that in the last 24 hours, Albanese was warning citizens to purchase and use only what you need. So the Australian energy security is very, very weak, and they are probably going to be bringing in a lot more laws, restrictive laws on the population, but also laws that would ensure less and less travel for the population, and perhaps even a rationing of fuel. And it might occur earlier than any European nations. So when what we see in Australia occur in the next month will expect to see in Europe. That will roughly be the template of what we'll see in Europe in the month or two thereafter. Um, so yeah, I suppose one thing to note as well that the countries that will thrive from this or will avoid the harshest consequences are the ones that are already not necessarily aligned with America's security and economic interests. Those that might have been perceived, probably correctly, as being adverse to America, at least traditionally, if not necessarily in their current government, structure. So countries like, in terms of Europe, you might see Serbia, for example, avoid the worst impacts because of their, notable aversion to America and their, I suppose, closer ties with China than with the US, which is obviously unique in terms of countries based in that region. So, it'll be keen. I'll be interested to know what countries will avoid the worst of it. But I reckon it'll be the ones that already have decoupled or were never coupled necessarily with America in the first place. These are very significant times. There's so many shifting sands across the world, and it's been said very, very many times by very many people over the last 12 months, but even more so over the last month, that it's very true as well that we are living in Sinwar's world. These are the seismic global effects of Al-Aqsa flood, and this is what the leaders of the Palestinian resistance saw coming. And I only wish they were here to see the day, but I believe they knew very well that they wouldn't be.
Wow, that's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you, Morgan. Yes, indeed. I mean, I was just it's funny that I came across today the Arabic term is tofun, and I believe it's connected to the word typhoon. So it's not just a flood, it's a storm. So the Al-Aqsa, it was both a flood and a storm that Sinwar unleashed. Um, so talking about the countries that are, countries that likely to weather this best are those that are least coupled to America. Um, doesn't look too good for us then, does it? Owen, if I could bring you in there on that somewhat pessimistic turn. Um, I mean, we couldn't really be any more coupled, could we? I mean, we're practically in their back pocket or front pocket. We're in the smelly front pocket. It's just in terms of if you could kind of lay out a little bit the level of our vulnerability in terms of our dependence on America, our dependence on energy imports, the lack of planning, talking about countries that have planned for this versus those who haven't. Um, yeah, how bad is it?
Well, as for planning, one thing that they're doing now, Justice Minister, Dublin Justice Minister Jim O'Callaghan announced his intention to establish a new migrant detention centre model based off the US's ICE facilities, or in part anyway, and this will hold non-Ukrainian asylum seekers whose claims are determined illegitimate by the EU migration policy, of course, not a sovereign Irish one. So on the surface, yeah, it's to placate anti-immigrant sentiment, which they have largely drummed up themselves by their policies. But why now? Why right at this moment? I have a feeling it's something to do with what is coming. There's going to be a downturn in the economy. There won't be need for so much cheap labor in the informal sector. So it's a kind of a warped contingency plan. Um, Kill two birds with the one stone. Placate these populist nationalists and um, yeah, plan for a bit of chaos and economic downturn. So
And sorry, Owen, just presumably as well, these ice type centers would be run for profit, right? That's the model. Just
Um,
like the iPass centers.
yeah, possibly. Yeah, they do seem to do everything with at least a semi-privatized element at the very least. I haven't read those details, but yeah, I'd imagine. Uh, so like as for the economic recession, I don't know if recession even captures it because it's something much more profound that is taking place here. Um, as for America shoring up their energy with Venezuela, um, I would say, Venezuelan oil is very heavy oil, um, and it really can't do the same things that oil from the Strait. The importance of the Strait of Hormuz, like it's we hear that 20% of the oil of the world goes through that strait, but that only tells a bit of the story because this oil is among the lowest in the world of energy return, or highest energy return on investment of any oil in the world. Like you literally stick a straw down a hole and suck it up. Like America, this is Texas in the 1930s. America's easily accessible oil like that is long gone, So obviously there are elements in America with regards to fossil fuel industry that are, you know, going to be really well off in the very short term. But I think, there's going to be stagflation. And if demand gets low, I don't think it's going to even benefit them really. Like what you have to remember about LNG is it is very high. It's the complete with regards to oil from the Strait of Hormuz, it is low energy return on investment, which also makes it, you know, sort of the best option for sustainability as well. Like we heard a lot of kind of pie in the sky stuff from, environmental NGOs in the last years about zero carbon and all of that. But obviously there is sectors of the economy that are impossible to decarbonize even within decades. Like so um we would need, and like gas isn't as essential as oil. You can't power a combine harvester on gas, a cruise ship. So we need this. This is so essential to and the more messing that they do in the Persian Gulf, the more targeting of uh, like these facilities, the the more catastrophic it's going to be for food security in the world. Like what they've done already is going to be felt even before this war. We've passed peak oil now with a few years, and they talk about this thing called a thermodynamic cliff, where most energy sources after a certain point they won't even be worth extracting because you will say Alberta tar sands, for instance, in Canada, you have to burn 2 barrels of oil to get 3 barrels of oil. That's how much processing it goes into it. And it's pretty similar with the shale fracking gas in the US. So, you know, there's obviously a lot of cowboy elements just at play here within, Dara talked about, competing inter-capitalist rivalry, and I think there is a lot of that going on here, but in short-term things like that. So, yeah, there is that, but altogether, um, I don't see how this will even benefit the US's even reindustrialization, if that is even anything more than a kind of electoral sort of, placating rhetoric. So, like, even before this war, like, I think it was 2 years ago or last year, 20% of the harvest in Argentina of wheat, I believe, went unharvested because of lack of access to diesel. So you need light oil uh, to make diesel. You can like the stuff in Venezuela, you cannot make diesel out of that. Um, the stuff in the US, some of it you can make diesel, but it's very low energy return on investment compared to the Persian Gulf. Really, the Persian Gulf is the place to it. And say if you're talking to someone on the street who doesn't give a shit about any of this, doesn't know, like, it doesn't have an iota of what's going on in the world. I don't care about Palestine. From a very pragmatic, self-interested basis. Um, After this, if the Iranians are successful here, um, the oil that we really need in the world, all that is going to be controlled by Iran. Really, the region is going to be dominated by Iran, and the technology we need in the 21st century. And, that's going to be um, principally more China than the West, because what are the West doing really that is really for social good, technologically. Um,
OnlyFans.
OnlyFans. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Fair enough. They're making lots of pharmaceuticals, which maybe we mightn't need anyway if they weren't making us so sick with the food and the water they pump out to us. But yeah, from a purely pragmatic point, anybody who says, well, we've made our nest, we're with them now, we need to pull our weight. Um, it's a road to nowhere, even if you don't have a big humanitarian conscience.
It's extraordinary at now of all time to hear those kind of voices being platformed. I was really struck this week how, we had just a week ago or a little over a week ago the sickening spectacle of Micheál Martin kissing ass in the White House, cozying up to Trump, saying what deals he could get. And then, of course, the argument always in Ireland is, oh, well, what can we do as Ireland? We're bound by the EU. We're this, we're that. We're dependent on the Americans. And then you see this counterexample in the last few weeks emerging in the form of Spain, where Spain is actually taking a stand. Like I read today that um, they've given notice to the Americans that they won't permit overflight of military flights over their airspace. They've already recalled their and permanently recalled their ambassador from Israel. So they're taking a couple of very strong positions, and they're already reaping some of the rewards of that. Not that I believe that was the intention, in that Iran has announced that Spanish flagged ships can pass through Hormuz. and they're probably getting some kind of a discount on the toll as well. And yet Ireland, all the time with this kind of, you know, condemnation of the genocide in Gaza, but then super careful not to upset the Americans. We're going to be like, we'll neither have the moral clarity of doing the right thing, nor will we, you know, we'll go down with the ship as well. We'll be the rats sinking as the American, the undertow of the American Titanic goes under.
Yeah, well, Martin was unsparing in his condemnation of the so-called regime in Iran. I saw him talking on American television, but he was also very, nervous as well. He seemed very uncomfortable, and he was like, "Well, we prefer dialogue, but you know." And yeah, it was just utter humiliation. Um, how can you call this statesmanship? Um, it's, I I don't know, has it sunk into enough of the general population yet? Um, I think it has, but unfortunately, people are so disenfranchised, they see all sides of the vassal capitalist bourgeois um, parliament is captured. We see right across, from from the from the the parties in power to the opposition, um, who sometimes, are able to call them out, but um, we have a lot of control behind the scenes, a lot of intermediaries, NGOs, kind of softening the scent before it gets to the higher level. And um, kind of, I've seen the way it works, the way uh, they they will sort of they will ask the questions in a way that they can be obfuscated. And I've seen it with, they'll ask them, maybe they'll phrase it how the NGOs want them to phrase the question, instead of what grassroots activists are saying. And it becomes an obfuscation game.
It becomes political theater, really.
Yeah.
And I see Paul Pongoldrick has his hand up, and I'd like to come to him in a moment. But the one last thing I'd like to ask you about, Owen, I mean, just in the last week since our last session, this story has been in several of the, it was in the Guardian, I think it was in the Irish Times, and probably in a few other outlets. No coincidence that it hit all at the same time, about Auchinish Alumina and this kind of hand-wringing worry that it's a kind of Trojan horse
Oh yeah,
for
that was a
Mhm.
very interesting article. It was curiously well researched, and if you look at the top of the article, I forget the name of uh, it was a collaboration with the Irish Times and another um, outlet entity, investigative entity. And if I looked into them, and they are fun. They are completely a wing of the National Endowment for Democracy.
So
So
a kind of Bellingcat type
yes, a
operation.
Bellingcat type operation. And now what they say, it's all true information. And I suppose it's welcome in a way, even if it is geopolitically motivated, whatever army, whatever military Ahinish serves. It's a it's an environmental disaster waiting to happen. So it really needs to be closed down and decommissioned. It's going to take years to even clean it up and try to avoid the looming disaster if those dams break, into the Shannon. So maybe we'll take that one, even though it's from
Right.
dubious sources. But can you imagine collaboration between the Irish Times and um, uh, an investigative outlet funded by um, Russian intelligence into the US Israeli um, dual use goods, which outstrips Ahinish, the value of the aluminium going to Russia by magnitude of thousands, by
Absolutely.
like I've talked to people working in Intel, and literally when they're on those what do they call them, like mechanized part of it where it is kind of there's a lot of robotics happening. If you hit one of these rails, like they're like them, do you know those time machines that you put the coin into and they have this, yeah,
Trying to
there's
grab,
all of
yeah, the
these
grabbers.
lifting
Yeah.
boxes, yeah.
Hmm.
And if you by accident touch off something, hit off something, and an alarm goes off, you have to report it straight away because it's in the magnitude of hundreds of millions. The whole system goes through a process of elimination, finding the error in the place. But that's how much, turnover is going on with those production microchip production lines in Intel.
Right.
So a bit of aluminium is nothing compared to that, in
That's
value
right.
terms.
Yeah. Yeah. Intel, I believe, accounts for somewhere close to two-thirds or three-quarters of Ireland's trade balance with Israel, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a million, Owen. That was brilliant. It's always very important to bring it back. It can seem like, you're a spectator in this great game, but it's only a matter of time before I mean, we're affected in terms of the horrors that we've seen of the last 2 years. You're affected emotionally. Some of us, through people we know, are affected also a little bit more directly. And then when it takes on this huge geopolitical kind of game of risk that we're in now, it can sometimes almost seem exhilarating, especially when you see, the likes of the Israelis getting hit. But of course, it is very much we're all in the same ship, actually, unfortunately. Paul, you've been very patient. Can I bring you in there? Just unmute and speak.
Yeah, good man. Cheers, Stephen. Just been listening, folks. Excellent analysis by our speakers to date. Particularly Dara there. It's very enlightening always to hear, I suppose, people talk about the politics of war, the economics of war, because um, it's nice also to hear Morgan talking about the likes of the Zionists getting hit and stuff. It's like everyone sort of tunes in and stuff, but without kind of thinking sometimes about the economics of war. And then even about kind of, as you're saying there, Stephen, being affected. I think when Owen started talking with Micheál Martin, I think I got a wee bit affected myself there. But yeah, you could see Spain, like suppose Spain not letting the US Army or whatever use its territory and the likes of the difference in Spain and Ireland. Well, obviously Spain, they're still a capitalist country and pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist, but the Spanish, like they have a history of being colonists themselves. Whereas Ireland, going back to Micheál Martin, it doesn't matter who's in government in the Free State. Like you go back over a century ago, 1922, and that state was founded. It was founded to be in subservience to imperialism. and that ilk of people has been in government ever since. So no matter what you see of any TD, minister, Taoiseach, whatever in the Free State, they are still subservient to that system. But so then, where does that leave us? Even Dara was talking about obviously there's going to be a massive recession coming down the line. And as we know, it's the collapse in capitalism with different names, austerity, recession, cost of living, whatever. But even sometimes we had to take it back to Ireland. So maybe Dara could give us a critique on where we actually are now. Where is the Irish left? Well, we know, I suppose, the absence of the Irish left, maybe, but how do we organise now within our communities for what is coming down the line?
Thanks very much, Paul. Derek, did you catch all of that? Would you like to come in?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul. So yeah, I think firstly with Spain, so what people often don't realize is that the Spanish government, I mean, Pedro Sanchez is from the Socialist Party, they're sort of center left, but his government is propped up by communists, by the Basques and the Catalan and Galician separatists all at the same time, who would be uh, at least in principle, anti-imperialist, even though they are capitalist and are still full of their own contradictions. But they have their base really rooted in Spain and in the working classes in Spain, where they are much more organized than we are currently in Ireland and perhaps particularly in the Free State, where I was living in Barcelona before. And interestingly, kind of perhaps the main way that they're organized, of course, they have quite a strong union movement. And I took part in two general strikes in Spain uh, in support of Palestine. But actually, the main way that they are organized is really through their neighborhood communities. And in that, there is a general shared sense of solidarity that I think is just constantly fading under neoliberalism and the individualism that it very deliberately creates. And even in terms of the structure of the Irish Free State, it's always really been run by a comprador class who have always been servants and middlemen for imperialist powers, and in particular between British and American interests. And even if you look at sort of the history even of the Irish Free State and sort of where the struggles have always been, it's mostly been a struggle for the land itself and the soil, you know, and even in the Proclamation of Independence, in the democratic mandate of the first Dáil, the soil is mentioned twice even within this. You know, and I think as you start to experience these shocks, like even, for example, the Irish famine, and even the famine a century before that in the 1740s. I mean, these at the same time were in the context of other European wars, and in particular, the Napoleonic War is really what gave the Irish agricultural system its shape, in that were serving as essentially the farmyard or the ranch of British imperialist interests to feed their working classes who were going through their industrial revolution at the same time. And then this big shift post famine towards more pasture and dairy farming because of essentially profit motives in British markets at the time. So I think in terms of the Irish struggle and how we can sort of rebuild these alliances to be able to collaborate more effectively along class lines, I think the core contradiction probably is the struggle for housing, really. And this is becoming more and more antagonistic now, where you have about 30% of the Irish population who are renters, who own about 3% of the wealth in the country. And even this recent Oxfam report that they did on inequality in Ireland, I can't remember the exact statistics now, but I think there was maybe 11 people who owned more wealth than maybe 85% of the Irish population. So you are starting to see these contradictions become more and more apparent, and you are starting to see now more organizing being done along these lines. The likes of Katu, for example, now you are starting to see become much more prominent as a representational body of the renters in the country. I think as time goes on, so even when I think Stephen mentioned earlier about just the apparent lack of planning or the lack of contingency plans that we seem to have for these shocks, we're being told we're in a housing crisis. Yes, they don't seem to have any plan other than to make things worse for people. We're being told it's a climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis, a food crisis, an energy crisis, and yet they don't seem to have plans to deal with any of these crises. But there are plans, it's just that these plans exist for a very small group of people, and the idea is to enrich themselves rather than to benefit the Irish population. So I think within this, obviously, the trade union movement and the workers' movement has been quite weak, in particular since this social partnership that was introduced in the 80s with the Haughey government, which was likely a precursor to the IFSC and attracting a lot of the foreign capital, was basically ensuring that Irish workers weren't going to be able to organize in the way that they had been able to do really throughout the 80s. I saw a stat, I think there'd been maybe 100 strikes plus in the 80s in the lead up to the social partnership agreement being signed in 1987. And in the 15 years after the financial crash in 2008, there was maybe less than 10. So I think that shows the sort of level of general disorganization among the sort of Irish proletariat as a whole. And sometimes it does take things getting a little bit worse in order for them to get better. And I think at this point, when we are sort of thinking along the general macro trends where even, for example, the tech companies, to start with, they don't employ very much of the Irish workforce. I think it's probably only about 5%. But they are also at an increasing rate automating and displacing the Irish workforce from this at the same time. At the same time, in the midst of an energy crisis, you're seeing a huge scale up of data centers across the country. You're seeing a growing environmental awareness. So even with Aughanish, with the Save Our Sperrins campaigns, with the resistance throughout the country against data centers. But these struggles have typically been in rural areas and they have been relatively isolated rather than kind of being connected through a unified movement. So at the same time, you see now the word sovereignty coming up a lot, and the neutrality debates also seem to be getting a lot more people involved in some sort of organizing. The Palestine movement has done the same in many ways. It's been a wake-up call for a lot of people and has politicized a lot of people in terms of connecting the behavior to the system. So I think the challenge is how do we sort of move beyond people just identifying problems and people connecting these problems to the capitalist system and then actually getting organized around shared interests. Now, easier said than done. As I said, it is happening, but in quite disconnected ways. So I think our challenge really has to be connecting these struggles along the lines of our shared interests.
Great answer. Thank you very much, Tara.
Good man, Dara.
Um, Barry, do you want to unmute and jump in there? You've had your hand up a little while as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned about the millions on the streets protesting against Iran, the invasion of Iraq. And we have seen millions of protests right across the world uh, for the same issue and for the Palestinian issues. And people are bound to be frustrated to a greater extent that none of these things seem to have had any major effect. And I think that's right because what has happened is that war and genocide has become normalized in a way. And of course, the thing to never forget is that wars and genocides are the work of capitalism. Whatever about imperialism, the highest level form of capitalism, the original idea, the original reasons, the cause is capitalism. And capitalism is not about to give up. Therefore, while it's shaken, while it's damaged, they're not about to throw in the towel. So therefore, wars and genocide will continue. But the answers to some of these things, to street protests and street marches and stuff like that, there has to be a building of people power within the countries, because governments are clearly not listening through the present electoral system. They have that managed. They can easily outmaneuver people's opinions and fool people into voting for them again. In America and increasingly in Ireland, it's more about money, in the sense that people are, the money spent on elections is phenomenal. So, it has nothing whatsoever to do with democracy or even free choice or any of that. So there's going to have to be a move within the countries as a consequence of all of these wars and genocides and all of this natural humanitarian outpouring by people throughout Ireland. We'll just speak about Ireland for now. There's going to have to be a building of some kind that prevents this runaway train of, rulers versus the people. Whereas it should be the other way around, that it's the people holding the rulers to account. And the only way that can be effectively done is if a system of, local people's councils and then intermediate councils work on their way up to the highest levels of governments. And a starting point to that there has got to be people on the left and Republicans and indeed communists for that matter being elected to local councils, but with people's councils, community councils in place, not to go into those chambers to, voice off and sort of play the game and sort of, look like as if you're very radical and all the rest, but to in fact eventually undermine and destroy that system. Because that's the only way that, the best example of this, who did it very successfully, is Vladimir Lenin, not John Lennon, that you might have been talking about, Stephen. And it's also him made that statement as well. We have to think about things in a different way entirely. And I think that the Irish people in particular, they have had 900 years of resistance. They understand resistance. Ordinary people in the street who have never been involved in anything, they understand resistance and they know what side they're on. And they know they're being shafted. The only thing is that they don't think that it's any of their business to do anything about it, other than to vote every 5 years. That's not sufficient. That's not going to work. That's never going to work. And how do we know that? Well, we've had about 300 years of the life of capitalism, and whatever about feudalism before that. But certainly we've about 300 years of the life of capitalism where democracy was supposed to be the democracy of the people. And we know for sure that it hasn't been. So we have a test place. We have a litmus test. We understand quite clearly that it hasn't worked. So the most important thing that I think that activists, all activists on the left in particular, have got to do is to get people to understand and convince people on the ground in their communities, in their areas, build relationships and build for people power within their communities. I know people power is sort of thrown out there as a kind of a throwaway statement. It's actually very real. And we see this, we have seen where people power has actually worked temporarily under great stress and pressure. But unfortunately then the sort of structures have never been put in place to retain any potential gains or actual gains that were ever made. And suddenly, it's like the rent and rate strike, for example, in the 70s, 1771, in the South was extremely successful. and it really put it up to the government and the local councils. And it was about the cost of rent and the types of rents and how rents was evaluated and all of that. And it went on for maybe nearly 2 years, and it was a serious battle right throughout the island of Ireland. But look at where we are today, back at the very same place, and people, that you can only do that so many times. Like, people become very disillusioned. I mean, think of all the people that have marched in relation to Palestine. Now, okay, a lot of it is emotionally motivated, but that's fine. That's grand. That's good. But those demonstrations and those type of events have got to be used for political building. They've got to be used to politically educate people. It's not enough to walk up and down streets. There's got to be, and that's our job. That's the job of the Father Donald Socialist Republican Forum, and we need to think like that, and to motivate all of that. And I have no difficulty in saying this. I mean, we have to be thinking about taking power in Ireland. I mean, I know that sounds like a very grand statement, but I mean, if you're out in the street demonstrating against housing, if you're out in the street demonstrating against health cuts or a non-existence of health, or any other protesting that you're doing, why are you out there if you're not about taking power in Ireland? Like, there's no point. So therefore, we have to build on that basis, and that's a very important thing to do. We have to think like that. We think there's a big protest going on in an area, but we'll say about the Sperrins or about the LNG plant down in Kerry that Owen talks about. I mean, that's not enough. I mean, that'll be tactical concessions and reforms. Diffuses all of that, and that's grand. You may win certain battles, but that's not enough. It's never going to be enough, because just like the rent and rate strike of the 1970s, you're going to be back in the exact same place again. And we have to think about that. We have to plan for that. Gary Margaret?
Very, very, very good words. Thank you. Thank you very much, Barry. Um, Paul, you want to come back in with another comment or question there?
Yeah, I just want to come back in there, I suppose, on Dara's points, and that's kind of going back in there what Barry was saying as well, with people having to join up the dots. Like every weekend, I'm no expert in, suppose, geopolitics, but from my own lived experience, like even coming up now every weekend, you're checking your calendar, what events on. There's a Palestine protest, there's a protest with the local hospital, there's something with housing. There's something happening every single weekend, and even going back to the rent strikes, it was in Dublin in the late 60s, early 70s. So again, because people aren't class conscious, they don't actually know, and it's kind of organized sometimes. Like I'd see it, say for example, you'd see say maybe nurses going out in the picket line, and rightly so, but it's organized self-interest. But you might not see them same nurses next week standing protesting with you over housing, because they don't really care. They've got their house, you know. So it's making people join up them dots and making people become more class conscious. And that's how they easily defeated which had great potential in the 1970s in Dublin with the rent strikes. And the ruling class, they will always compromise. And that's what they done. And what you see in that time, if the Irish ruling class, they were working to a neoliberal ideology before neoliberalism maybe even became a thing. So how did they diffuse that? The rent strikes they offered people the chance to buy their house. And then what is that? The wider outworkings of that, you're talking half a century later, a housing crisis, an engineered housing crisis. And again, it's enriching the privateers and whatnot. So to be in your community and being able to make people join up the dots, that's where it's at. But I know it's no easy feat. But and again, going back, I always think there it was you that quoted Lenin at the start, Stephen, centuries where nothing happens in weeks, where centuries happen. And in Ireland, it is very, very frustrating at times when you are involved in activism and that. It's hard to keep going. But I see Tommy, though there's Tommy is there, and I always go back to something Tommy told me, and Tommy had said, I'm sure Tommy not mind me saying, in 1966, Tommy being from Tyrone, when the Orange State was at its pinnacle, it was even illegal to fly an Irish tricolour, but in 66, it was the 50-year anniversary of the Easter Rising. So them old Tyrone people, they were holding a few what would have been illegal or commemorations to mark the 50th anniversary of the Rising. And Tommy was talking, he was only a young cub, maybe 14, 15, and there was older Republicans saying about the youngsters nowadays that they're useless and they're this and they're that, and they're listening to Beatles music and wearing pointy shoes. But events and circumstances create change. As Tommy says, 3 years later, the state was up in flames. So again, it's always about events and circumstances, but we need to be ready on the ground, because when them events and circumstances come, and which they will, we need to be ready because someone else will move into that space, the far right or whatever, you know.
Great. Very, very good points. Thank you. Thank you for that, Paul. Tommy, I was looking at you a moment ago. Can I bring you in on that point?
Thanks, Stephen. Paul, thanks, Paul, for putting me on the spot like that. Uh, Listening to the original speakers there this evening, excellent addresses. Especially, I think the talk about what it seems to be the imminence of an economic crisis across the world. I'd imagine we're not even talking about recession, we're probably talking about depression. It'll be something that's going to affect us all quite drastically, because the situation now is that America and the US and their allies are going to have to try and smash Iran. And it appears now that they're not going to be capable of doing that. So we're looking at a situation where either one or two things happen: is that the Americans break off the engagement and allow Iran to effectively control the straits anyway and charge for exporting oil. But inevitably, I think we're facing a major depression, and that could be that will be the crisis that's possible to tip the balance. And at that point, I think we've got to ensure that our agenda is not piecemeal, that we're not talking about affordable housing, we're talking about public housing. We're not talking about easing the payments for health services, that we're talking about a national health service free at the point of entry for all aspects of health from teeth right through to every aspect of health, that we're talking about education, comprehensive free education, that we have a combined package to meet the recession. And hopefully we can maybe point to some other areas where there has been success made. But I think that's the point, that we're going to be faced with that crisis, the inevitable crisis in capitalism, a recession and depression. When people, we know at the moment that housing is a massive crisis in both north and south of the border. Health care is becoming more difficult, even dental care. Education, it's okay to talk about free education, even south of the border, elements of it's free, but to send a teenager to third level education costs a working class family huge amounts of money in terms of upkeep, rent for accommodation, if they can even find accommodation. These are all huge problems that I think it'll highlight and underline the fact that the bourgeoisie, the comfortable bourgeoisie of which we've spoken, are insulated against the worst of the effects. It's going to be obvious that there's a class conflict, and we've got to be fair to show that. Not that we're going to have one answer to it, but we'll have a comprehensive package. I think that'll be the answer when this crisis comes, and it inevitably always comes in capitalism. It could come sooner than we think.
And Tommy, just to come like the scene that Paul described of you speaking at that commemoration in 1966. I mean, when you look back in hindsight, do you see now more clearly the signs that the wall was about to break in the six county state, that there was a moment of collapse impending? Did it
Well,
or did it seem very solid at the time?
it seemed solid in the middle 60s. As the 60s went on, it appeared to be under challenge, and the challenge came very quickly and unexpectedly. But it was something that had been building for decades, but it came very quickly and unexpectedly, and places that hadn't spots and occasions that had never been anticipated. But there was an inevitability about it that it was going to happen somewhere, someplace, sometime. And I think this is the thing to remember. Now, we made some changes in the 6 counties, but arguably we didn't take it, obviously, apart from the fact that the British are still in overall charge. But we didn't opt for a socialist state. We fought to break the connection. Ultimately, that was the point. Now, again, let's go back to the thing of the crisis here. That when we hit this, when the crisis comes, we've got to have a very clear manifesto, very clear objectives. That it's not a matter of addressing a tweak here and a tweak there. We've got to transform society with a comprehensive package, which is actually a socialist workers' republic. Now you can call it, we can use whatever terms you like. We've got to define it in such a way that we can only answer the problems by comprehensive package, which effectively is the workers' socialist republic.
Thank you for that, Tommy. I think what we'll do now is I'm going to stop the recording because we're already running quite long on the recording, and then we can continue the discussion and for a little while longer, whoever wants to stay on. So I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you very much for everybody. Thank you to Owen Harris, to Dara Cogley, to Morgan O'Kearda for speaking, to Tommy, to Paul, and to Barry for your contributions afterwards as well. I think once again it's been very productive, very wide-ranging, and very stimulating discussion. So I'll stop the recording now.